So if you remember, there are two types of fiscal policy. There's automatic fiscal policy, and then there's discretionary fiscal policy. Automatic means that it doesn't require presidential or congressional approval. It just happens. Whereas discretionary fiscal policy requires governmental approval, requires congressional or presidential approval in order to make it happen. And then if we dive down into these discretionary fiscal policies or fiscal policy in general, we're targeting one of two things. We're targeting either the taxes or we're targeting the spending of the federal government. So we've talked about some of the tax brackets or some of the tax acts that have come into play. And then in the previous slide, we talked about another one that involved a little bit of spending action, but a lot more of the tax action. Well, I'm going to go ahead and talk about in this video more along the discretionary spending policies, that spending aspect of that fiscal policy. And furthermore, we're going to talk specifically about the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act of 1986, and then it was again amended in 1987. So let's back up. What is discretionary spending policies? Discretionary spending policies are the annual formulation of the federal budget. How much are we going to spend in that federal budget by the president? And then the spending programs authorized by Congress. So those are those two players, either congressional or presidential approval. And it's looking at how much are we going to spend. Remember in the last video, I said that that last policy we talked about really didn't go anywhere with governmental spending because we had all these different programs that we didn't really want to give up on spending, that we didn't really want to lose any bit of that spending. And part of that's why is because these are programs authorized, spending for authorized programs by Congress, and the politicians were fighting in order to keep their programs. Or to keep certain programs that they're in favor of. So let's dive into this Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act of 1986. It is the most noteworthy discretionary spending policy. We really don't have very much of these discretionary spending policies because it's kind of hard to give up how much you want to spend on things. So this was one of the most noteworthy ones. It had an automatic trigger involved. One of those automatic discretion or automatic fiscal policies was actually written into this. So one of our automatic fiscal policies actually came from this budget. And it was in direct response to the record levels of deficits of the 1980s. So in the 1980s, we were seeing record level budget deficits, and they were trying to counter that. They were trying to get rid of that. So because of that, they enacted this Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act. So what did this actual budget actually do? What did this act do? Well, first and foremost, it set forth the maximum allowable federal budget deficit with the goal of actually balancing the budget by 1993. So it basically said, hey, federal government, there's only so much you can spend. If you don't make X amount, or you can only spend so much over and above the amount you make, we're going to put a cap on how much you can actually spend. You can't just keep spending and spending and spending without any revenue stream. So it set a maximum allowable federal budget deficit. And the other aspect of what it tried to do was it had a goal of actually balancing the budget. So what does a balanced budget mean? Well, a balanced budget means we're spending what we're making. We're not spending more than we're making. And in some cases, hopefully, we're actually making more than we're spending. Hopefully, we have a surplus. So it was trying, in 1986, this was written and amended in 1987 in order to set forth a budgetary plan. By 1993, we're at a balanced budget where we're operating with no federal budget deficit from year to year. So in 1998, the deficit was actually projected to exceed $10 billion. So in 1998, we were expected to have a $10 billion budget deficit. And this $10 billion budget deficit actually triggered the Act's sequester feature. And another aspect about this particular policy, the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act of 1986, is that it actually cut spending across the board. It pretty much cut spending across the board with the exception of interest payments, Social Security, and entitlement programs. So in the 1986, 1987, whenever this policy was going into place, basically all federal government programs, unless you were or it pertained to interest payments, Social Security, or entitlement programs, they were cut. It was across the board cuts. So it was a across the board sequester by discretionary action designed to cut spending or raise revenue. So this act sequester feature, what it was doing was basically, it was across the board, and it was a discretionary action designed, and it was designed to cut the spending or raise revenue. And that's essentially what they were trying to do with this particular act. Mainly, this particular act was to try and force a balanced budget and to reduce overall. It was meant to reduce the overall budget deficit from year in and year out.